Hi, welcome to the first Illustrator tutorial video. In this video, we're going to use the project of a business card to learn some of the basics of Illustrator. I like this for a couple of reasons. One is that it's small, both in actual size and in content. When we get into site plans and planning docs, you'll see that these files get very complex quickly. So if you're just learning Illustrator, it's nice to start on something that's a little more discrete, and there's only so many ways you can go off the rails on something the size of a business card. Also, right from the start, we can start being a little creative. Um, Illustrator is kind of a fun program. It's easy to draw, it's quite intuitive, and we'll try and have some fun and develop a logo from scratch. What's going to be on the business card? Well, you can do it for the company you want to work for. Maybe you're imagining the type of consultant you're going to be when you graduate, or the type of firm that you want to work for. All these things come into play, believe it or not, when you're just laying out the business card. There can be a lot of content packed into a small space. There's two components to this project. The first one is hand sketching. The second is the Illustrator work. It's important when you start any type of design project to do a little hand sketching, get something down by hand. If you jump right on the computer, especially when you're still learning the software, it's really constricting. So I'm going to ask you to do some concepting by hand, some sort of sketches, just some ideation, and then do the finished product in Illustrator. And I'll first walk you through a couple of projects that I did in that same way so you can see what I'm talking about. So back when I was a MUP, a couple of my peers and I decided to try and form a little company and make a little money with our newfound planning skills. And this was going to be GIS based, and the name of the company was Join and Relate. And here you can see that I was doing some sketches, some studies, trying to come up with some kind of logo for this company, Join and Relate, which, if you know anything about GIS, that was kind of a cute name for a company. The idea was that my colleagues were more about community development, and so it would have been a great name. Didn't quite get off the ground, but I did a lot of work on trying to get the identity. We almost got a gig, and sometimes all it takes is that first gig. So who knows? Could have been. So after doing a bunch of hand sketches, I refined it a little bit in Illustrator, as you can see here, and then move on to construct the assets with it, letterhead, business cards, envelopes, all that other stuff. In this case, never ended up getting printed, of course, because the company never took off. But that's sort of the process. Start with some sketches, try some different things. Here's another company that I did a same workflow for. This company was called Union Survey. And here I'm just trying some different things, maybe something in 3D, maybe something that looks a little retro. Um, I'm not, committing to anything. I've got a lot of different choices, and I'll go and talk to the stakeholders, the people who are going to be paying for this, and try and see what they think. It's a good idea to share your work early. Make sure you're on the right track. And so your sketches and your loose work have to be confident looking enough and finished looking enough so that you're not embarrassed to present them. So here, this was maybe on the bubble a little bit, but good enough to present. Then I'll refine it a little bit. And I really started liking these D and E versions where this was something I found in an old, like vintage yellow pages. Um, it looks, when I look at it now, it looks very like the BMW logo, but it was actually a sort of takeoff of some parts of an old record company, a record label that I found in an old yellow pages, which is actually a great source of just clip art and glyphs and stuff like that. So first with some freehand sketches, get some direction, firm it up a little bit in Illustrator, as you can see here, and then ultimately leading to like final versions of the logo and final renderings. So that's the typical workflow. And on this slide, you can see some versions of the UIC 40th 40th anniversary sort of logo type that I did when I used to hold down a desk on campus there, actually Kappa's 40th birthday. And I still have this in my email signature line. I guess I'm waiting for the 50th. Or did the 50th happen already? I don't know. I didn't get the gig to do the logo again. So you can see different options, different looks. Don't think you're done when you get one idea. Design is an iterative process, so keep trying different things. It's also important to view these types of things in situ, as they say. So here you can see I'm experimenting with different logos. I haven't committed yet. How does it look on an envelope? How does it look on an email signature line, and so on? It's important to kind of look at these in place. And when you look at the assignment sheet, you'll see another example. You don't have to do pages and pages of this, but do some studies, work through the process. You're here to learn this stuff after all. You're probably savvy enough to know that for $5 you can get online and have people bid on your little job. Try and avoid those kind of ready-mades when you're in school. It just doesn't it doesn't move the ball forward at all. That's the unfortunate reality of the world that we live in. Skills that we work hard to achieve, especially these types of rendering skills now and design skills, are sold for peanuts on the international market. So it's actually kind of depressing. Anyway, so work through the process and do some sketches, and I'd like you to turn those in as well as a page or two. And don't think that they're garbage. Oftentimes, other people can see the potential in what you think are throwaways. Don't throw this stuff away when you're done. Keep every page of what you do in this class. So, with that said, maybe it's time to spin up Illustrator and see what that's about. Okay, when you spin up Illustrator, you'll see a screen that hopefully looks something like this. Here's your recent files if you have any. You can go through this dialog, but what I recommend is that right from the start, even though we're beginners, we're all sort of adults and smart. So what I'd like you to do is when you're working on Creative Cloud apps, keep one hand on the keyboard and one hand on the mouse. So probably for you, that's right hand on the mouse, left hand on the keyboard. And we're going to try and incorporate shortcut keys as soon as possible, right from the start, in fact. Almost all the shortcut keys start by holding down Control and typing the first letter of the command. So to get up the new file dialog box, I'm going to hold down Control and type N, Control N for new file dialog, and it brings up this new document dialog here. You're seeing a lot of the same choices that we would get in other ways, but I do think these shortcut keys are the way to go. That's what advanced users do. Right hand on the mouse, left hand on the keyboard. A lot of shortcut keys. Here we can select different formats and define a size that we're going to work at. Um, there are different settings, whether your file is going to web or mobile device or print. So I'm going to select print. And even though we're going to be working on a business card in a bit, I'm going to start with a letter just because we're also familiar with that size. Here on the right, we can see that the width of a letter is 612 pt by 792 pt. Well, you can see that PT stands for points, and points are 72 to an inch. So if you divide 612 by 72, you should get 8.5 because we're in portrait here. I'm going to set this to landscape only because our monitor and our screen is landscape. And instead of points, I'm going to work with the more comfortable inches. And we'll start with one artboard. Artboard is sort of the sheet of paper that we work on. and it's going to be 8.5 by 11, a basic size that we're all familiar with. I'm going to keep the rest of these defaults for right now and just say create. And that's going to bring up our first artboard. I'm going to go ahead and close out some of the customization I have going here. And what I'd like you to do is use, there are different workspaces in Illustrator. Up in the upper right-hand corner of the top drop-down menu bar, I've got something called Essentials Classic going. That's what I recommend using. And the reason for that is only because it's what I learned on, it's what I'm comfortable with. So this white area that looks like a sheet of paper is properly called the artboard. It is 8.5 by 11 landscape, so long side on going left and right. And for Creative Cloud apps, unlike say GIS, my recommendation is to just jump in and start sort of having some fun. So if we look on the left here, um, I don't even know what these toolbars are called anymore. I'll move this one, maybe it'll reveal its name to me. There are tooltips. If you hover for a minute, it will tell you what the command is. Anyway, this is sort of a basic tool palette that you'll want up all the time. It's up by default. I forget what it's called just now. And you can see 1, 2, 3, about 5, 6 down, there's something that looks like a rectangle. If you hover, the tooltip rectangle tool comes up. Just select that tool and you can just start bombing out rectangles. I'm just clicking, holding my left mouse button and dragging rectangles. When I say click or pick, that's the left mouse button. When I say click and drag, that means you're going to hold down the left mouse button while you drag your mouse, and that's what I'm doing now. And so it's very easy to just draw imprecisely, but kind of fun. Illustrator is a very fun drawing tool. It's much looser than AutoCAD and God forbid GIS, which you'll find is very difficult to draw in at all. Okay, so notice what my cursor looks like. It looks sort of like crosshairs. I'm still in the rectangle command. You can see it's still selected. It's waiting for me to put in another point of a rectangle. And until I do something else, it's going to expect that I'm going to keep bombing out rectangles. If you're not doing something specific, like drawing rectangles, the tool you should have current is called the select tool. This is what we'll call our basic cursor. Looks like a black arrowhead, or if you're old enough to remember that arcade game Asteroids, this looks like kind of like the spaceship in Asteroids. This is your basic select tool. In fact, it's called the selection tool. And this is what you should have current on your cursor when you're not doing anything else. You can see as I move over these rectangles I've drawn, they're ready to be selected. They highlight just as I hover the cursor over them. This one is selected. That must have been the last one I drew. I can just pick a rectangle and it'll be selected. Notice that only one can be selected at a time by default. If I want to select more than one, I hold down Shift. And while I hold down Shift, I can add or remove rectangles from my selection set. So holding down Shift and selecting adds or removes items from a selection set. What's a selection set? Just a bunch of stuff that's selected. What can you do with something that's selected? Well, if I hit delete, everything that was selected will be deleted. So a selection set is a collection of entities on which you're going to use an edit command. For example, delete. Some quick navigation. How am I zooming in and out? There's two ways to zoom in and out. I was using Alt scroll wheel. So that's holding down the Alt key and using the mouse scroll wheel. Another way is to go Control plus to zoom in and Control minus to zoom out. Left hand, use the left hand on the keyboard. You got two controls, notice, at either end of your keyboard. You don't need to have a Thelonious Monk range between your fingers there. Everything is sort of easy to do. So Control plus zooms in, Control minus zooms out, or Alt scroll wheel zooms in, Alt scroll wheel zooms out. I think most people prefer Alt scroll wheel. If you want to pan, you're going to hold down the space bar and drag the mouse. It's called space bar drag. So I'm holding down the space bar. Now I'm holding down the left mouse button and it's still down as I drag. Space bar drag is pan. So that's the basics of navigation. If you want to zoom to the extents of your artboard, let's say you're way zoomed in tight somewhere, you don't want to use the control minus or the scroll wheel. Control 0 zooms to the extent of artboard. That's actually very useful. So we've learned a bunch of shortcut keys already, and you can start to see why you're going to need that left hand on the keyboard. We use shortcut keys and modifier keys. When we hold down the space bar and drag, that's a modifier. The space bar is modifying the drag behavior. What are these things? These are rectangles. They're properly called, I think, closed paths. There are three parts to a path. I'm going to do a Control A, Windows select all, and hit delete. Yes, Control Z is undo in this program like it is in most programs these days. I'm going to delete again. I'm just going to draw one rectangle. Again, when I'm not doing anything, I want this selection tool current. Notice as I hover over the selection tool, that V in parentheses, that means there's another shortcut that can take me right to the selection tool. Just V, not Control V in this case, because you know Control V, that's a Windows command. That'd be Windows paste, I think. Um, so just V will get you back to the selection tool, your default cursor, unless you're in the middle of a text command. If you're in the middle of setting a string of text and you type in just the key V, well, then you'll get a letter V, of course. All right, I'm going to select this closed path. And notice when I select something, my menu choices here below the drop-down menus change. This is a context-sensitive menu. And depending on what you have selected and how many of what's you have selected, the choices that are visible up here are going to change. A couple of things to take note of. These black and white swatches, they're also available down here. These are giving me two of the three components of a path. One of them is fill definition. Right now it's white, so it doesn't look like anything on the paper. Change that to a fill color of blue. This is stroke definition. That's just color. I'll change that to something garish, and I'll give the stroke some width so we can actually see it. All right, so there's two, fill definition and stroke definition. The third component, I don't remember where I learned this, but it's always stuck with me, and I think it makes a lot of sense. Third component is the thing itself, the shape itself. Why is this important? Because it's entirely possible to have a closed path with no fill definition and no stroke definition, but it's still there, right? So there are, think of it as three parts to a path. There's the bones, and you can set, fill, and stroke definitions, but the bones by themselves do exist, and there's a lot of operations where that invisibility, if you're not always conscious of it, can cause you problems. All right, so you may know already when you see a little triangle in the lower right-hand corner of any tool, that means it's a flyout. So if I click and hold on this rectangle, for instance, I see I have a rounded rectangle tool. I'll just try it. I also have an ellipse tool. Those are fun. You can draw different types of ellipses. And I have a polygon tool. By default, it's a hexagon, but you can change that. I also have a star tool. Who doesn't need a star once in a while? You can also change the number of points on that if for some reason you need a star. It's also the flare tool, which I don't know what this is about, but it's kind of cool. Everybody likes to try that. Excuse me, it looks like it belongs on a different toolbar than with these. We'll do a Control A and delete everything again. And notice on these flyouts, the last tool you used is current. So make sure you get to know what's all on these flyouts. So if you're looking for a rectangle, but you see the star tool, you won't get lost, right? So rectangle, rounded rectangle, ellipse, polygon, what's not here? A couple of shapes that you would think are even more basic than these are not here. For example, we have a rectangle, but we don't have a square. We have an ellipse, but we don't have a circle. That's because the way you get those shapes is by starting a rectangle. Let's say I want to draw a square, but then I'm going to hold down the Shift key. Shift is a modifier key, and you'll feel this. When you hold down Shift, I can't make it a rectangle. It is going to force it to be a square. Similarly, when you try and draw an ellipse and you hold down Shift, it makes it a circle. It will not let you draw an ellipse. So Shift orthogonalizes your geometry. It locks the width and height aspect ratio. So that's how you get a square. That's how you get a circle. A triangle, that would be a polygon. And instead of me just going into click and drag, I'm going to click just once and it'll bring up this dialog for polygon. How many sides do I want? Well, we said we're going to do a triangle, so 3. The radius, I think, is the circle that would contain that shape. I always forget if it's inscribed in or circumscribed around it. But anyway, so that's how you can get all kinds of shapes, obviously in Illustrator. Lots of complex geometry is possible in Illustrator. Um, okay, oh, what did I just do? I just moved this. To move something, you select it, and notice how my cursor looks when it's hovering over this thing that's selected. It's got this little grid hanging off it. When I'm away from it, or even within the bounding box but not over the geometry itself, it's not there. If I were to click here, it would just deselect. But when you see that little grid, that means I can click and drag now. If I window both of these things, I can click and drag both of those entities. You know how these Windows bounding boxes behave. If I hover near a corner and get the curved arrow, I can rotate. Control Z to undo that. I can resize these by changing the bounding box. And notice if I resize and hold down Shift, it constrains the aspect ratio again. Shift orthogonalizes your geometry. Also in a move, let's say I needed to move this perfectly horizontal. It's kind of hard to do with a mouse. A mouse is not an accurate drawing tool. If you hold down Shift, it forces that. It locks it into 0, 90, or 45 degrees. Those are the orthogonal drafting, the most important angles in drawing orthogonal projection. It takes a little getting used to. The interface is actually very subtle in Illustrator. So, little changes to your cursor is what you have to watch out for. It's very subtle. The whole interface with this nice sort of shades of charcoal is all very, artistically sort of reserved and subtle. The downside is sometimes you have to really pay attention to what Illustrator is trying to tell you. Okay, but what do you do when you want to draw something that isn't a rectangle or ellipse or square or one of the basic shapes? To draw complex geometry in Illustrator, the tool you want to use is called the pen tool. And it's this tool that looks like an old-timey ink nib. You can see it also is reflected on my cursor. So the simplest way to start playing with this is to just pick a point, 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 and I'm drawing complex geometry. When I want to close the shape, I'm getting some I'm getting some work messages here. You want to hover your last point near the first point. There's a big difference how these act if they're closed versus open. So if you want to close it, notice when I get close to that original point, I get a little circle on my cursor. Now it's there, now it's gone, now it's there, now it's gone. And when you see the circle, it's going to close the shape. Shortcut to get to my regular select tool, just V, and I'm back on my select tool. So this is created with a pen, and you can create all kinds of complex geometry using the pen tool. It's a difficult tool to master. It's not very intuitive. It's not like drawing rectangles and ellipses, but with a little bit of practice, you can get it. What if you need to edit this once it's drawn? Let's go ahead and give it a fill definition and a stroke definition. Get an IKEA thing going here. What if I need to modify the way this looks now? Well, to do that, I'll use a different tool called the Direct Select tool. Looks just like the Select tool, but it's white. And I'm going to select the geometry once, and notice I don't get a bounding box. That's because the point of this is to go inside the geometry. So when you draw a rectangle, let me just select and delete this. When you have a rectangle, you think of it as 4 lines, but in Illustrator, in fact, the definition of this Bezier curve is contained not in the lines, but in the endpoints. And that's why when I go to edit it, I actually edit the endpoints. And so what I did was I used the direct select tool, selected the shape, and now I can click and drag on these endpoints. And if you miss the endpoint, you sort of have to pick it twice. It'll move the whole shape. These are called corner endpoints, and they can also be smooth. Notice, remember the context-sensitive menu that changes based on what's going on? Right up here, I can convert my selected endpoint. It's a poor color because it's blue, same color as my stroke definition, but I can convert that endpoint to a curved endpoint just with one click, or back to a corner. And when it's a curved endpoint, the anchor has these handles on it. So I also have control over the way that the curve comes off of the, I'm gonna make some toast here. The way the curve comes off of the anchor point, what I've been calling an endpoint, properly called an anchor point. Okay, so I can also draw shapes with these curves using the same pen tool. Instead of just clicking a point like I did the first time, I can click and drag, and notice I'm holding down my left mouse button. It starts to put in the curve. You can see when I pick my next line, and if I drag it again, this is how you draw curved geometry, by clicking and dragging, or at least irregular curves. I don't like how this is a little rough here, so I'm going to go in the direct select tool, select it, and just move that out till it smooths out. Maybe adjust the anchors. And I have full control over what this ends up looking like. This is very time consuming. The thing about Illustrator is it is time consuming to draw. How it tends to work is you invest the time up front, but then you have something very solid that's very robust and creates a very small file. Like you might be able to draw this quicker with pixels in Photoshop, but you don't have this type of editing capability that we have in Illustrator. So you pay for it up front, but then you have something that's quite editable, very robust. It's never going to pixelate because there are no pixels here, and you can get a lot of use out of it. So you kind of spend the time up front. Pen tool though, takes some getting used to. Give it a try, play with it a little bit, see how it goes. It's perhaps the most counterintuitive tool I've ever used. Very hard to draw with. I'm gonna do a Control A and delete. So that's the pen tool, and the direct select tool is how we go inside geometry to adjust it. And believe it or not, you can draw very complex things with that method. I'm doing quick, bold sketches, but you can draw all kinds of complex stuff with that. The last thing I want to talk about a little bit before I go setting up a business card file is type. Um, there's two kinds of type, both triggered using the type tool. Shortcut, I guess, is Control T. Would that be right? Yeah, looks like it. Control T brings up the character tool palette as well as the paragraph tool palette. These are useful to have when you're dealing with type, and also starts the, I guess if they were open, it wouldn't open it, and also gives me the type prompt on my cursor. So the first type I'm going to demonstrate is called point type. I'm just going to pick a point once. And I started typing. Remember, I can't use V here because it would just give me the letter V. So that's point type. I'm going to select it. Notice my context sensitive menu changes again. I'll make it a little bigger so you can see it. The other main type of type is called paragraph type. And to do that, I'm going to click and drag a shape that I think is about the size of the paragraph I want. And now I'm going to start typing. So maybe you've already noticed the difference here, and the main difference being that paragraph type flows, and automatically I can resize this paragraph, and the text is going to flow into the shape. If you try and do that with point type, what you get is this. It either condenses or expands the type. Big difference in what kind of editing you can do with it and how you need to edit it afterwards. So take care. Point type, you just pick once and start typing. Paragraph type, you click and drag. And it doesn't matter what shape you click and drag. Oh, it'll fill up with placeholder text. That's nice. Because you can always resize it. Let's look at this in a little more detail since we're bothering. Notice that when I have my shape smaller than the text that I have typed, I get this little thing called an output. See this red box with a plus sign on it? That means I can actually select that and flow into a new paragraph. Really useful when you're setting up, interesting pages. The type flows from one to the other. And that's the kind of thing that, try doing that in Word with text boxes, a bit of a challenge, I think. So really nice. So you can flow type from one shape to another, and it'll overflow. You can also use any closed shape as a text container. I'm not going to bother changing the definition of this because as soon as I start putting type in it, it's going to turn invisible. So I'm going to start my type command again. Notice as I hover near the shape, my type changes, my cursor changes again. See that circle that came around my cursor? That's telling me that it's going to put it in that shape. And I can't even be bothered to like type anything right now. It's just been a long day. So you get the idea though, it's flowing in that shape. And just like I don't know when you would use a shape like this unless you're doing some sort of like action poems or something. But it does flow, and it will also still have the output, and you can do all kinds of very interesting things with type on a page using this behavior. Okay, so I have been really, really sloppy. Why? I haven't even mentioned layers yet. Probably could have been the first thing I mentioned. Um, I'm just going to expand my layer palette here, and everything in Illustrator goes on a layer. You can have many, many, many layers. I'm just going to go ahead and bomb out a few layers. Layer order determines draw order. So you almost always want text on top, and then I'm going to draw some squares and some triangles and some circles. And then the rest of these I'm just going to delete. So anything you create goes on the current layer. So with circles, I'm going to start circles current. I'm going to go ahead and start drawing some circles. Remember, you hold down Shift. I'm too busy to draw all these circles, so I really just want to copy this one. I'll get it to look like something first before I start copying it. Let's get some nice subtle colors here. Really garish. You can do the kind of copying that you're used to, Control C, Control V, that'll work, but notice it put it in a more or less random location. The way to copy in Creative Cloud is to click and drag. Sorry, it's called Alt Drag. So I've selected it and I'm holding down Alt while I drag, and notice my cursor is now a double cursor. That's telling me that it's making a copy. Alt Drag. It's known as alt drag, but you'll have better results if you drag and then alt, if you know what I mean. Start the drag motion first and then hold down the alt key. Alt, again, one of the modifier keys. So I said layer order controls draw order, but within a layer, you can also send something to the back or front, but that's only within a layer. I'm going to make my triangle layer current, and let's go ahead and make a few triangles. And again, I'm going to use the Alt drag to copy that. And now there is no way I can send this to the back, arrange, send to back. It's never going to go in back of the circles because it'll only go in back on this layer, right? Get the idea? I'll make squares current. Oops. And I'll go ahead holding down Shift, right? And that's how we control draw order. What if I wanted my triangles to be actually in the back? I could just grab this layer and move it within the draw order and move that to the back. Oh no, I actually wanted my squares to be on the bottom, and oh God, disaster. Look, I can select a square. I put all these on the wrong layer. I put it on the triangle layer. How do we move something from one layer to another? You're going to do that about 1,000,000 times when you're working. So all these triangles that I drew, I'm sorry, all these squares I put on the wrong layer. So I'm going to select them by holding down Shift. They're on top because I drew them last compared to the triangles, so they're easy to select. I'll show you at some point a more elegant way of selecting them. But to move entities from one layer to the next, you can see these are on the triangles layer, but I want them on the squares layer. Notice here that the triangles layer and the circles layer has this little caret showing. That means there's something on the layer. Squares layer does not have that. You know that's an empty layer. Turns out, if you expand that, every single entity has a sub layer. Every single thing, whether it's text or a photo or anything, is going to have its own sub layer. For the most part, you don't want to work at the sub-layer level. Layers are confusing enough, and it's typically enough organization, but there are some times when you need to get into the sub-layer level. Make sure you don't accidentally start working at the sub-layer level. Makes things a lot harder. Anyway, to move things from one layer to another, see this little square that's highlighted? It's magenta. The color of this layer is magenta. All that means is that the bounding box is magenta. It's got nothing to do with the color of entities that are on here. It's not like AutoCAD where you can have color by layer. This is just the color essentially of the bounding box. I've never found any other use for it, to tell you the truth. There might be one that I don't know about. Anyway, just drag that little indicator and put it on the layer that you want. And you can see right off the bat, I'm going to Control Z to undo that. You can see they went to the back because squares is the bottom layer, right? And I like to test it. I'm never so confident in my work that I don't want to give it a test. I'll turn off that layer. Yep, looks good. All my squares are on that layer, all my triangles are on that layer, and all my circles are on the top layer. So layer control is extremely important in keeping your drawing organized. You can have many, many layers. I think it might be close to unlimited. So don't go cheap on the layers. It's worth the time. Text is almost always on top because you never want your text to be overstricken by some geometry. So typically, text is always going to be the top layer. All right, let's set up now. We talked about primitives, we talked about the pen tool, and we talked about type. And let's go ahead and set up a card for our business card and get started on sort of having some fun trying to design that. Okay, so let's set up for a business card. Control N, shortcut key for new file. And this time we're going to create our file to be the size of a business card. And how big is a business card? It's 3.5 inches wide by 2 inches tall. We're doing a real square sort of business card here. Also, I want to introduce this concept of bleed. We're going to put in 0.125, that's 1/8 of an inch, and because this was selected, it added it to all 4 sides, top, bottom, left, right. Bleed is how we get color all the way to the edge of a page. So notice how this artboard looks. We've got this crisp white edge, and that's where our artboard ends. It's what you're used to working on. I'm going to go ahead and say create. And here is our business card. Notice that our business card has a red border off the artboard. We don't have that here because I didn't set it up for bleed. Bleed is as I said, how we get ink all the way to the edge of a paper. And what that means is that we have to design it past the edge of the paper, and then the printer will cut it. Sounds a little confusing. Let me pull up some photo examples. And in fact, you know what full bleed is already because you've seen it a bunch of times. So here you can see on this magazine cover, we got ink all the way to the edge of the page. When I open it up, you see ink all the way to the edge of the page. How is this done? Everything you've ever printed had a margin, or if you printed it without a margin, it was scale to fit, and the printer added a margin. So in professional printing, and full bleed is the hallmark of professional printing, you print past the edge of the finished size of paper, and then you cut it down to size, which means that you have to design past the edge of the paper, and some of that is going to be cut off. It's as simple as that. You've seen it all over the place. You just never thought about it probably. So we're going to design using full bleed also. Okay, so back to our Illustrator file. and we see we're set up for full bleed. What are we actually going to design? Well, you guys all know what a business card is, and I don't want to spend too much time guiding you as far as like design concepts. I'm sure you'll do a Google image search. There is only about 10 million different images you can look at for inspiration. Um, the design itself, I'm not so picky about what you do. You can be very conservative. You can be a little more outlandish and free. Doesn't matter. We're using this as a vehicle to learn Illustrator. So as far as the design, I leave that up to you. If you're going for a professional conservative look, though, know that that's just a style, like any other style. There's nothing inherently like superior about it. And I would encourage you maybe to experiment a little while you're still students. You've got your entire career to do boring conservative work. Not always boring, but conservative work. So, now's the time to do a little experimentation, but you can also work within a sort of strict professional style if you want to do so. I'm going to set up some layers. What do I need for layers? I don't know. For sure, I need a text layer, right? I'm going to have some sort of, let's say, a logo, perhaps, um, and maybe a base or a color or a base logo or a texture, something along those lines. Let's keep it simple. I'm going to delete these other layers. Notice that when I went to rename them, if I double click on the layer name itself in the layer palette, it'll let me do it right there. If I accidentally click the layer somewhere off the name, it opens the layer options dialog. I can also rename it here. This gives me some other um, aspects of the layer that I can edit also. Here's the color that I mentioned. Color doesn't mean anything, doesn't change the color of anything in Illustrator, it's just what color the bounding box is. I can decide I want a layer to not print, maybe. Maybe I have some guidelines on a layer. I need to look at them and use them, but I don't want them to print. You can control some of that stuff here. Show and preview. This, I think, goes back to the days, especially preview, when memory was more limited. Used to be that computers could barely run a software program like Illustrator. It was a challenge. These days, with the computers that most people are running, it's not a big deal. So I have some design in mind. I actually don't, but let's just pretend I do. And let's say I need some sort of base texture. I'm going to look online and see what I can find as far as base texture goes. Actually, I have lots of textures. I save textures all the time. So let me quickly go and see what I can find. And don't ask me why, but I kind of like stone. I'll try like a subtle stone background. I found one. A couple of ways you can bring an image. I'm bringing a photograph into my Illustrator file. You can use the command file place and go and select the image or whatever the other file is. You can see it's on my cursor. I'm going to zoom out a little bit because business cards are tiny. A lot of the background images I have are large. If I just pick a point, it's going to drop it in full size, and I can go ahead and edit it from there. I'm going to Control Z to undo that. File place again. While it's on my cursor, I can also click and drag and actually put it right to size almost. Um, and that sort of eliminates some of the uncertainty of doing this. Um, it's going to drive me crazy. It doesn't matter that this is hanging over, but it's going to drive me nuts because I'm just sort of that way. I'd like this trimmed to the exact size. I'm not going to actually trim it. What I'm going to do is mask it to the right size. It's on the right layer. It's on my base layer. So keeping that layer current, I'm going to draw a rectangle that's exactly the size of my um, business card, including the bleed area. And when you need to draw something exactly the right size, you can get it close and then go and check the under the transform button, check the actual sizes of it. And I did an offset of 0.125 in both directions. So that's 1.5 tall plus 0.25. That should be 1.75. Sorry, the X That's giving me the location. X and Y is the location, in this case, of the center of that shape. What I'm interested in is the width and height. So a business card is 3.5 inches. I added an eighth on both sides, so that's 3.75. 2 inches tall, an eighth on both sides, 2.25. I happen to get it at the right size. I'm sort of good at snapping like that. So it is the right size. Now, I don't need to do this next step, but I'm going to do it to demonstrate the clipping mask that I'm about to show you. So I'm going to make that rectangle I just drew look like a picture frame. See it? It's a yellow picture frame. And I only want to see the stone that's inside that picture frame. Now, like I said, I didn't have to change the way the rectangle looks. It would have worked if it was solid black or solid white, doesn't matter. Now what you do is select both things. I'm selecting the image and the rectangle, right click and make clipping mask. And two things happen. One, it clips that image in this case. And two, notice it's still there though when I hover over it, it's still there. Two, it makes that path disappear. It's still there, of course. We can see it's working, but now it's got no stroke, no fill definition. This, I'm guessing, is going to be a little dark. So I'm gonna change the opacity a little bit to lighten it up some. There's different ways of you could do this, but dropping the opacity sort of the quickest, easiest way. Okay, now I'm going to lock that layer because I don't want to accidentally scooch it, because things in Illustrator are very prone to being accidentally scooched, and I don't want to do that. I'm going to add another layer. I'm just going to call this, my card's going to be horrible, by the way, just so you know. Um, Color block, and with that layer current, I'm going to draw a color block. And let's see, I'm going to use for my color maybe like a yellow, something really terrible, but something you can see on the screen. And I'll go ahead and go in there with the direct select tool, and I'm going to make it a little bit of an asymmetrical thing. Okay, and I'm going to lock that layer too. Now with the logo, what's a logo? How do we play with logo? Actually, let's do the easy stuff first. Let's make text current. I'm going to go ahead and put in my text. And my name is Tom Yasek, and I can't type. If I would have known how important typing was going to be, I would have taken it more seriouser when it was time to learn it. I'm going to change this font to something that's maybe a little more not default. Fonts, subject matter for a different day. I'm going to use a modern sort of sans serif font. You know what that is now if you've watched the video. How big? This is where you have to sort of do some experimentation. Um, the text on business cards is tiny. I would say something in the 10 or less point range for certain things, for details. So some more text for details, maybe. I'm going to Alt drag to copy, but I want this to be right in the same line. So I'm going to Shift Alt drag to copy perfectly vertical. And you know, I can copy perfectly vertical or perfectly horizontal or at a precise 45 degrees. Shift is a modifier and Alt is a shortcut key. Shift Alt drag. You can layer these shortcut keys and modifier keys. So here I might have my email, or maybe my phone number. This is going to be a public facing video, so I'm not going to fill out all my personal details on here. Not like I'm not findable. This might be a little smaller, or should it be? What's the most important thing on the business card? Maybe it is the email. I redesigned my company's emails, sorry, my company's business cards. And I started by thinking, how do I use these business cards? How do I ever use business cards? You think a business card's thing of the past, you'd be wrong. Any meeting you go to, people still pull out their business cards. It's part of it. And what I always did, and what I saw people doing is they would leave the business cards in front of them on a table. And in my case, it was so I would know who is sitting around the table. And sometimes I would put them in order so I could sort of, I don't care if people know what I'm doing. I got to remember somebody's name when I need to speak up. I don't want to be like, hey, dude. So I thought the most important thing was the name, and everything else was far less important because ultimately this gets input into your Outlook or your phone or something. But at that moment when you receive the business card, the name is the most important thing on there. It could be dim lights in the room. It could be a crowd. Who knows? But I don't want to have to hunt for the name. And on some business cards, you actually do find yourself hunting for the name. So I'm just going to make a sort of design choice here and say that the name is the most important thing on the business card. More important than the title, more important than the company even, is the name. And I told you my card was going to be horrible, so don't even give me grief about how stupid it is. Um, when you are a designer, when you're a graphic designer, this would not fool anybody as a class in graphic design. Things like how the text interfaces with this angle become really important. How you notice I just tried putting it over the W. I can see that it's clumsy. I don't have the time or willpower to make this interaction work. Maybe this yellow should go the other way. All kinds of reasons why this is a clumsy thing. But try playing with some stuff. I don't really, let's say I don't even really know what I'm doing. I'm just sort of, trying to make something happen. And I'm learning Illustrator in the bargain. Let's make sure all my layers are still good. So far, so good. What if I wanted a logo? What about a logo? Um, if you read in Blackboard, check out the McWade on logos. That's a good. I don't generally go for the how-tos, but this McWade on logos looks like I have him in week 3. And this is one of the better how-tos that I've ever seen. And if you're interested, it's a quick read, very graphic, lots of symbols, some good pointers on how to think about designing a logo. And if you'll recall, some of the logo success stories I've had have been accidental or fluky sort of uses of other images and whatnot. One thing you can try though without too much stress, and it'll help you learn Illustrator, is try a typogram. That's where you make something out of just letters. So a classic way to start this is with your um, initials. This is a classic sort of design exercise. So there's lots of ways we can adjust this type um, and keep it as type. So what if I want to try something? I'm going to go ahead and make this bigger because I know I'm going to mess with it. So I'm going to ramp this way up. What can I do with this to make it a little more graphic? Is it interesting? There's certainly nothing interesting about a TJ. What if I look at the character um, choices here and how I can adjust um, the character? Okay, the character being the letters. Word of warning, when you open a tool palette, by default, it doesn't show you everything that's there. Go to the upper right-hand corner on that menu flyout and show options. There are lots of other things that I just happen to know because I know Illustrator that I should be seeing. And I'll never understand why they made the default to not show the other tools, but they did. Okay, a couple of things I can play with here is the letter spacing, sometimes called leading, or the letter width. And those are right here. If I want to adjust the letter width, and there's tooltips on this. That's what they call horizontal scale. And if I want to adjust the letter spacing, I can, for example, bring those closer together. I'm just sort of playing with some stuff here. till I'm getting something that looks graphic. I don't mind if it's a little bit lost. I can select just one letter. Oh, it's just that it's weird because I've condensed them so much. So here's, I don't know, it's starting to look like something. I mean, it's horribly what's the word? Um, I've seen it. I'm not interested in it. I've seen stuff like this. And it starts to act a little weird because of what I've done to it. What if I rotate it a little bit? You see what happens is it won't rotate because it's paragraph text, because I use paragraph text by definition. If it was point text, it would rotate, but I can use the object transform rotate command. And what if I try and echo this? What is that, about 15 degrees? And if you ever see a preview option, use it because it'll save you some time. Maybe it's more like 13 degrees. Just roughly trying to match the angle on that yellow. Let's go 12. Okay, I'm going to take that and maybe I'm going to make this a little bigger. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm playing is what I'm doing. Sorry, I know it's never fun to watch someone play, but that's what I'm doing. And sort of just trying to come up with something really is what I'm doing. Um, and they can't all be hits, but I'm trying. And I like the way I'm sort of violating the border here. Uh, I want to see that this is going to be trimmed, right? I'm going to make this a little bigger, and I'm going to be done real quick here. And okay, so maybe this will be interesting when it's printed, right? That's always what you hope. So I'm going to select that again and put that on the logo layer. And now it's going to be under the text, and maybe I'll give this some transparency also, just the opacity down. So it's just a little more of a hint. Okay, I warned you it was going to be horrible. Mine was crap because I did it in 10 minutes with you watching. Yours is going to be great because you're going to spend some more time on it. And remember, this is the bleed. It's going to trim at this line. I want some of this logo to be trimmed off. I'm hoping for a dynamic sort of interaction. A lot of stuff missing. Oh my God, my letters, my AICP. How can I forget that? That's got to be on there. Um, you can't just wash bottles if you don't have your AICP. I like this to be a little smaller than the name it's attached to. Okay, so let's say I'm done, even though it's terrible. Okay, what I want you to do is I'm going to have these professionally printed for us. So I need you to save a final PDF for printing. Once you're done with the design and everything, go to File, Print, save it out to a PDF. Let's see, PDF, one copy, media size. I'm going to see what I've got here. I wouldn't mind seeing this on a letter to start, but I don't want you to turn in a letter. I guess portrait is okay. And it's going to be centered. And under marks and bleeds, turn on the trim marks. You see what's happening? It's telling the printer where to trim. And let's print this and see what we get. Just as a sort of test. Another thing is I've been zoomed in quite a bit. It's important that you spend some time working at actual size. And here we see the final product. You see how these trim lines work? Let me zoom in a little bit. If you were to print this up on 8.5 by 11 paper, you could lay a steel rule down and cut connect those lines and cut there, and you'd have ink all the way to the edge, and you wouldn't see the trim lines anymore, and that's how you get full bleed. Okay, so that's looking pretty good, but of course, do not give me an 8.5 by 11 because I'm going to have these printed, uploaded. So when you go to print for me to submit these, we can't use 8.5 by 11. We're going to want to do a custom size, and our size is going to be the actual size. This snapped right to it. It took the full measure of the trim lines. But what if we do just the bleed? So that would be 3.75 wide, right? 3.5 plus a little bit, and 2.25 tall. And let's see what we get for that. Notice the file naming. Yeah, that's what I'm looking for. So I can still see the trim lines, see, just so. Boy, that really zoomed in. Trim lines, right? They're there, but I'll be able to upload this to the printer. I'm gonna use an online printer, and then I'll somehow get you one or two prints so you can see what it looks like professionally printed. So this is going to be what you would submit on box in a week. Hopefully better than this piece of garbage, but it doesn't matter. It's your first attempt for a lot of you, and it's just going to be fun to see it printed on cardstock and glossy and so on. So don't worry about it if you don't think it's great or anything like that. It's not what we're here for. We're just here to get better, try some stuff, have some fun. This is supposed to be a fun class. So let's try and make it like that. Okay, that's enough for one day. And when we come back to Illustrator for our next exercise, we're going to be doing some sort of planning documents, much more complex, much more sort of into it, but it's important to get these basics down and layer control and type, pen tool, your primitives, closed paths, and so on, and get the basics down, and you'll be in good shape. You'll have something to build on. Thanks for watching.